Hello, this is Chris Ganson at the Office of Planning and Research. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. We'll let folks file in first. Hello, this is Chris Ganson at the Office of Planning and Research. We'll wait just a couple more minutes for the rest of the folks to file in and then get started. All right, hello everyone. This is Chris Ganson at the Office of Planning and Research. We'll go ahead and get the webinar started now. So welcome. I will be doing most of the speaking once again, Chris Ganson of the Office of Planning and Research. We will have a few other people in the room to help. gather your questions. We'll talk a little bit in a moment about how to how to ask questions through the webinar. Chris Calfee will join me to answer questions towards the end of the presentation, and we will attempt to answer some questions in line if we can. Some logistics at the outset. This session is being recorded and it will be posted to our website. All lines are muted, and we will take questions, clarifying questions during the presentation, and longer questions at the end. We'll have a long time for question and answer at the end of the presentation. Ask questions by entering your question in the text box as indicated on the slide through the GoToWebinar interface. And if you have technical problems with the webinar, please call the GoToWebinar number, which is on the screen. Okay, we'll be starting off with some background today. We'll then get into the updated draft implementing SB 743. Next, we will look at some case studies implementing the updated draft. Fourth, we'll run through next steps and timeline. Fifth, we'll talk about a couple of related initiatives, including the Caltrans Transportation Analysis Guidelines and Transportation Impact Study Guidelines, and general plans and impact fees and how they're connected to SB 743 and the work we're doing here. Okay, so background. Why are we here? Why was 743 passed? I'll start off with a diagrammatic example of use of LOS in infill to start to answer that question, and then we'll dig in a little further. So in this diagram, you have an infill development built in a central city. There's kind of outlying suburbs or exurbs to the on the top and to the right. That infill development will load relatively little vehicle travel onto the roadway network. It's relatively little because the infill development is centrally located. It's likely to be located near transit lines or good bicycle or pedestrian facilities in a more walkable neighborhood in the center with destinations that are closer. And yet, even though it loads relatively little vehicle travel onto the roadway network, it triggers numerous LOS impacts. And the reason for that is that infill development is by definition last in, and so the traffic coming from the development, generated by the development in this case, is layered onto the existing traffic. And so where level of service is frequently already up and near a threshold, leaving that last in development to trigger the threshold and hold the infill development responsible for mitigation. So let's compare that to an example, greenfield development, a development on the urban periphery on the outer edge of an urban area. So that development will typically load 3 to 4 times the vehicle travel that the infill development loaded onto the regional roadway network. And yet it'll typically have less in the way of LOS impacts. And that's not that it's causing less congestion or adding less travel. Again, it's adding 3 or 4 times the amount of vehicle travel typically. But traffic generated by the project is dispersed enough by the time it reaches congested areas that it doesn't trigger LOS thresholds, even though it does contribute broadly to regional congestion. Also, here is an example of a level of service A street, and by comparison, an example of a level of service F street. And you'll notice there's a lot of vibrancy in the level of service F street. It just so happens that this is one of, or perhaps the most economically productive street in the state, University Avenue in Palo Alto. So those slides were by way of introduction of the issue. Over the past few years, and especially in the time just before 743 was passed, we had a lot of stakeholders come to our office and share problems with using LOS in CEQA. And we've compiled all of that stakeholder feedback into this slide listing those issues, and I'll go through them now. The first essentially just illustrated, it punishes last-in development, inhibits infill, and pushes development outward by assigning all of the impact, or a disproportionate amount of the impact, to the last-in development. That makes last-in development less viable, makes outlying development relatively more viable. And in our state, that's an issue because we are endeavoring to reduce greenhouse gases with infill development and accomplish a number of other state objectives by focusing on developing infill over outlying and greenfield development. Second, while mitigating LOS can solve local congestion, at least for a time, it exacerbates regional congestion, and that's because accommodating the automobile and all demand for automobile travel leads to more automobile travel, and that is loaded onto the region's roadway network where it congests. Third, use of LOS and CEQA acts to inhibit transit, the development of transit projects. A busway, for example, a bus rapid transit lane, a bus rapid transit project including a separated bus lane, will sometimes leave less space for single occupancy automobiles, even as it moves quite a bit more people down a corridor. And LOS mitigation can lead to the project needing to make decisions to compromise the bus service in order to accommodate additional single occupancy vehicles in a way that can even reduce person throughput on the corridor. So it doesn't see, it sees vehicles rather than people. One way to put that issue. Fourth, it inhibits active transportation. So the LOS metric inherently sees pedestrian cyclists, sees them as impediments to transportation rather than transportation in their own right. And so mitigation for LOS can look like prohibiting or reducing the facilities for pedestrians and cyclists. Now this is important for a number of reasons, and I'll just touch on a few of them here. One is that active transportation obviously is emissions-free. It contributes especially to vibrancy in neighborhoods and eyes on the street from a planning perspective, but also facilitating active transportation has enormous health benefits. There have been studies showing that just in parts of California and in regions in California, that getting active transportation up to a larger share, mode share, and folks walking and biking for just several more minutes a day can reduce healthcare costs by billions of dollars. Fifth, LOS is, roughly speaking, a measure of mobility rather than a measure of access to destinations. And that's a problem in a state that is endeavoring to solve its transportation and environmental problems by putting uses closer together, by using proximity. So access to destinations comprises of both proximity and mobility, and a mobility metric just sees half the picture. And I'll illustrate what I'm getting at here with a slide, with a graphic from the Denver area. So over the 25-year period, 1982 to 2007, in the Denver area, Denver did quite a bit of infill development. So they built a lot near the center, and that development generated a good amount of extra traffic, less than it would have had with outlying development, but still it had a good amount of traffic associated with it, and that traffic caused extra rush hour delay, if you look at the last line. So over that time period, Denver went from having 4.2 minutes of rush hour delay to 11.7. So from a mobility perspective, a delay is a metric of mobility. Transportation, Denver did terribly for transportation. They got worse by 2.5 times. But from the underlying interest we care about in transportation, which is access to destinations, getting people to places, if you look at the average travel time, that went down a bit. So Denver was actually doing better. A mobility metric showed it doing worse. We're endeavoring to do the same thing that Denver was doing over this period, infill development, to get people to places more quickly, that's likely to create more delay. And if we use mobility metrics to guide our way, we're going to get it backwards. Sixth, and this is especially for the traffic engineers out there, LOS actually doesn't measure mobility that well. It isn't a good it isn't a good means to optimize the roadway network, even for automobile travel. And the graphic that I have up is Bray's paradox. It's an illustration of Bray's paradox. And what Bray's paradox says is that you can relieve a bottleneck. You can, say, expand a lane. You have traffic congestion, you add a lane, or you somehow relieve a bottleneck. And just doing that without considering induced travel, without considering any other factors, that can end up worsening traffic if that traffic then goes downstream and it can worsen a bottleneck, an even more important bottleneck, and cause even more system delay than you had in the first place. So this is an illustration of use of LOS in CEQA on an intersection by intersection basis. Is not optimizing the roadway network even for automobiles, even before considering other modes, and even before considering environmental factors. A seventh issue stakeholders brought to us was that LOS used in CEQA forces more roadway construction than we can afford to maintain. So if in reacting to a CEQA significant impact on LOS, we lay down additional pavement in order to accommodate additional vehicle travel to improve the LOS of the intersection, we're contributing to a pre-existing problem, one that exists in nearly every jurisdiction in the state. There are a few exceptions, but there are very few local jurisdictions, cities or counties, which can show how they will pay to maintain their existing pavement. So it's exacerbating a potential and forthcoming fiscal problem. And finally, LOS is hard to calculate and inaccurate. So in order to calculate LOS, a first step is to run a transportation model that includes the project and show what the additional vehicle travel will be and where exactly it will go, because it's important to know which intersections it will travel through and even which turn lanes or through lanes the traffic will use in order to calculate LOS. Except for very large streets, the error on that calculation in modeling is substantial, on the order of a third or so, 30 to 40%. Once you have that number, you can do micro-simulation in order to find out what the delay will be and translate that into LOS, adding further error. It's frequently the numbers behind LOS are frequently reported to a number of significant figures, 3 or 4 significant figures, but in fact, we don't know even really fully to one significant figure. It's not to the 10% that we have an accurate answer on what the delay will be through an intersection. So those are the issues that were brought to us. I'm going to just skirt through the process that we went through in order to land on the metric vehicle miles traveled. We put out a preliminary evaluation listing the metrics that had been raised to us. There was, it's reasonable to say, I think, consensus on vehicle miles traveled, and I'll discuss some of the benefits of that in a moment, but first there is a clarifying question.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on this a bit, but we had a question or a request to give a little background on SB 743 itself, its current state, some of the politics, etc.
Right, that could be a whole webinar in itself, but I'll answer it briefly. SB 743, some of you are probably familiar, did a few things, one of which was to provide CEQA streamlining for the arena in downtown Sacramento, another of which was to direct our office, the Office of Planning and Research, to develop a replacement transportation metric for automobile level of service standards. And it required that we shifted away from LOS. It required the CEQA guidelines to provide a shift away from LOS in transit areas, and then it also said in other areas, not within a half mile of transit, that we could look at any metric. And so we looked broadly, I alluded to this briefly, we looked broadly at a number of metrics, including automobile level of service. Did it make sense to retain automobile level service as a metric of impact to the environment under CEQA? What we found was that vehicle miles traveled made sense across the entire geography of the state. There was no geography or project type that we heard any argument for LOS being a better metric of environmental impact than vehicle miles traveled. And so I'll transition back to the slide and use that as a segue to describe some of the advantages that we see in using the metric vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. First, it removes a key barrier to infill and transit-oriented development because those developments tend to exhibit low VMT. It, second, streamlines transit and active transportation projects because those tend to remove vehicle miles traveled. Third, VMT is easier to model than LOS. You don't need to figure out what's happening at each particular intersection. It's a much more aggregate metric. And from so far, what we've heard from those who do the calculations and do both, calculate both LOS and VMT, is that VMT typically takes between a fifth and a tenth, so between 10 and 20% of the time bandwidth consultant dollars to model when compared to LOS. Fourth, VMT is already being calculated. So CEQA already requires calculation of greenhouse gas impacts. And in order to calculate those, a step along the way is to calculate vehicle miles traveled. So it's already done, and in fact there are court cases pointing to that it's already required to be used in CEQA. Fifth, reduction, again, using the VMT metric and mitigating for it will not lead you to lay down additional pavement, saving you those infrastructure, capital, and maintenance costs. Second, it's VMT mitigation is a more effective regional congestion mitigation, is more effective for regional congestion mitigation because you're removing cars broadly, or removing vehicle miles, removing the amount of vehicle travel loaded onto the network. That helps to relieve congestion, where LOS just addresses localized congestion and thereby worsens regional congestion. Seventh, I already alluded to health benefits associated with active transportation trips and also transit trips, which tend to have active transportation trips embedded on the way to the stop. Eight, VMT reduction aligns with GHG reduction. So those are some of the benefits that we and others have shared that we expect in the shift to VMT as the primary transportation metric in CEQA. So some have asked, well, is VMT as a single metric, does it capture fully the impact of transportation? And this slide is an attempt to answer that. We see VMT as an umbrella metric for a lot of environmental impacts, and listed a number of them here. I'm not going to go through them in detail because, again, that would probably be a whole nother webinar's time, but there are a number of impacts both directly from vehicles and indirectly from the sorts of development that has a lot of VMT associated with it. I'll give a couple of quick examples. In energy use, higher VMT development is also tends to use more building energy because it tends to there are fewer low VMT development has more attached units compared to high VMT development. Also, unit size comes into play. There's research showing that there's a substantial difference in energy use between high VMT and low VMT development, just of the building energy. Similarly with water use, high VMT development tends to have larger lot sizes, and that means more irrigated land, et cetera, et cetera. What I will do, though I won't go through each of these bullets, I'll mention that each of the bullets does have either a paper or a body of peer-reviewed literature that we've assembled associated with it, and we hope to get a summary of that out in a little more detail within a month or two. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about VMT measurement at this point, and I'm going to distinguish using tour-based models. You may have heard them called activity-based models. Those tend to be the tour-based models, and distinguish those from what we often call the old four-step models or the old travel demand models, the trip-based models. So first, an example of a tour-based view of vehicle miles traveled. Here we have a person in a household leaving on trip 1, going from their residence to the coffee shop, trip 2 from the coffee shop on the rest of the way to work, during the lunch hour taking trip 3 and 4 to and from the Chili's for lunch, and then at the end of the workday, trip 5 back to home, and then in the evening, trips 6 and 7 to a store and then back home again. So this travel day consists of 2 tours. So there's the work tour. Any tour that involves the workplace is typically called the work tour, and discussing tour-based VMT analysis or modeling. Hang on a sec, we're getting a little feedback, so mute. Okay, sorry about that. And then the other tour is a shopping tour. It's not part of the work tour. Together, there we go. Together, all of this vehicle travel and the daily vehicle travel is called household VMT, or in this case, the one of the residents' household VMT. The full household VMT would be these travel patterns for everyone who lives in the house if there was more than one person. So let's compare that to trip-based VMT assessment. So a different example, trip number 1 here is from home to work, and then 2 back from work to home. Trip number 3 is what would be seen in tour-based modeling as a shopping tour. It's a trip out for coffee, trip to the store, and trip number 5 again back home. So trip-based model will be able to attribute the trips that have one end or the other at the home. So trips 1, 2, 3, and 5 comprise home-based VMT. Meanwhile, trip 4, the trip-based models cannot see that trip 4 is connected to the home in this diagram. They just see it as a separate link. And so when looking at home-based VMT, you're looking at, again, 1, 2, 3, and 5. Now, household VMT, or a tour-based look, as you can see, is a more comprehensive view of household or office VMT. And so we recommend, where possible, using it. However, of fundamental importance, it's important to use the same, either home-based or household, again, either tour-based or trip-based. It's important to use the same method for calculating project VMT, for calculating the threshold, and for calculating any mitigation. So where one of those 3, the information available is only trip-based, then we recommend using a trip-based assessment. I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to case studies. Okay, so onward from there, let's talk about the draft we recently released. I'll talk a little bit first about what we've kept the same, and then I'll go into what has changed. So we are continuing to recommend that the primary metric of transportation impact statewide is vehicle miles traveled. That's the same as in the previous draft. We are also recommending using VMT screening maps for residential and office projects. That's the same as our recommendation in the last draft. And here we have an example in the picture to the right, which is at least part of the Fresno region's map, or a map developed for the Fresno region using the California statewide travel demand model. I'll talk a little bit more about that model and the data that is available from it a little bit later in this presentation. But as you can see, there are low VMT areas you can see in the key green areas at which existing development exhibits low VMT And so similar development in those areas would also be expected to exhibit low VMT, and therefore you could presume them less than significant. Now that's a very quick and easy way of streamlining a centrally located low VMT development. Again, we've carried that recommendation forward from the previous draft. Next, we've also carried forward a recommendation to presume development near transit as leading to a less than significant impact, although we've included some new exceptions there. If there is a floor area ratio greater than 0.75, if that might be less than 0.75, I might have that backwards. If the project is parked at greater than the minimum requirements, and if it is inconsistent with the SESs, we recommend that nullify the presumption of less than significant impact for near transit projects. Next, we are keeping our recommendation that transit, active transportation, and active transportation projects lead to a less than significant impact. Those sorts of projects will generally reduce VMT, and so that presumption helps to streamline those sorts of projects. We also continue to recommend or continue to observe that more stringent thresholds than those that we recommend can be applied at lead agency discretion. So traditionally, lead agencies set thresholds within CEQA, and that doesn't change here under SB 743. We do provide some guidance, which I'll get to in a few slides, but lead agencies we make clear in our recommendations are able to apply more stringent thresholds if they so choose. Okay, and now I'm going to talk through at this point some of the comments we received on the last draft we put out, and also talk about the updates that we made from the last draft. So one of the comments we heard from many people, many organizations, was that technical advice is better given in a technical advisory instead of included in the guidelines, the CEQA guidelines themselves. And so we have made an update and taken most of the content of our last draft out of the guidelines themselves and created technical advisory and moved that information there. So now the guidelines update is on the order of a couple pages, and the technical advisory is 30-something pages. So on thresholds for various project types, we'll start with residential projects. Some comments we received on residential, on the recommendation we made for residential project threshold. A couple we heard most were, first, that there needs to be some flexibility in threshold setting. There was concern among outlying cities that focusing on the regional overall VMT per capita would leave them kind of entirely, their entire geography triggering significant impacts. And there was a second concern that the average or the overall VMT per capita as a threshold is not good enough for making the improvements we need. Average isn't good enough for getting where we need to go for state goals such as greenhouse gas emissions reduction, as well as the array of other environmental considerations in our state, farmland preservation, etc. So in this draft, we update our recommendation for the residential threshold to 15% below regional or city vehicle mile traveled, VMT per capita. So this means that the or city part means that if you're an outlying city, you can refer to your average or your overall VMT per capita. And that means that development in the relatively transportation efficient areas in your city would be expected to fall under the significance threshold. So it should provide streamlining for those areas that are relatively streamlined within, or relatively, low VMT within your jurisdiction. Okay, and on to our recommendation for office projects. There we heard a similar comment. Average is not good enough for state goals such as greenhouse gas reduction, and so we updated the office threshold to 15% below regional VMT per capita. We focused on the regional geography for office because commute trips are the longest daily trips and frequently cross city boundaries, so it made sense to keep a regional focus. So I want to talk a little bit about why 15%, because we've gotten that question a lot, and without going through that, it might seem arbitrary. I would mention that the recommendations that we provided for thresholds, I mentioned earlier, our guidance is explicit that cities can provide more, jurisdictions can provide more stringent thresholds. But the thresholds we're recommending provide sort of a backstop of the threshold levels that looking across state policy we see would be in line with state policy that's established. So I'll get into this in a little bit more detail by describing what sources, where the 15% came from. A first place is Caltrans' strategic plan specifies a reduction of vehicle miles traveled per capita 15% by 2020. SB 375 has targets for the metropolitan planning organizations of the state, and if you kind of add those up across the state and collect them, the overall target is around 15% per capita reduction. AB 32 in the previous draft of the scoping plan, or the current draft of the scoping plan, recommends local governments set greenhouse gas reduction targets at 15% below existing by 2020. And we also wanted to approach this from a feasibility perspective, and research shows that 15% VMT mitigation is generally achievable in projects. It would be true that there would be occasional projects that would not be able to reduce 15%, but generally they can, and there is collected evidence for that in CAPCOA's Quantifying Greenhouse Gas Mitigation Measures document. So how about retail projects? We actually updated our recommendation both on the methodology and the threshold, and this is more of a change than with the other land use types we had recommendations for that I've gone over already. So the comment that we received is that new retail tends to redirect trips rather than generate new trips. So when you build a store, people don't go shopping for the first time. They generally reroute their shopping trips from wherever they were shopping before to the new shopping. So our updated recommendation is that there's a few updated recommendations. First is that retail be assessed with a net VMT approach. And that essentially can be done taking a snapshot before the project. It could be a snapshot accomplished with a model, and then taking a snapshot after the project, modeling that, and observing whether the VMT, the overall VMT in the area, goes up or down. So if that retail development increases VMT, in other words, if travelers are making longer trips or going further in order to do their shopping as a result of the new retail, that may be considered significant. Meanwhile, locally serving retail often reduces VMT, typically reduces VMT, and that's because it's adding destinations into the urban fabric. So now shoppers have the option to go to a closer store rather than a further store typically. This is as opposed to regional serving retail, which sometimes draws travelers to a further location than they were shopping at before. So, audio trouble, hang on one second. There we go. So locally serving retail, we recommend is presumed less than significant to be VMT reducing. Okay, mixed-use development. We've gotten a number of questions on that. So our recommendation is that you could consider each use separately in a CEQA analysis and compare to the threshold for that use. So the residential component of the project would use the residential methodology, and then compare to the residential threshold. Retail would use the retail methodology and compare to the retail threshold, et cetera. Now, the mixed-use development still should perform better than even similarly located single-use development because of the mix of uses. It's because some of the trips will be from one part of the development to the other part, and that will reduce VMT. And so each use should take credit for the internal capture due to the proximity of the other uses in the project. So the benefit of it being a mixed-use project should still be seen for the analysis of each of the uses. We think that a lot of mixed-use development will, under our following our guidelines, would be presumed less than significant. And an example here, a residential retail development, if near transit or located in a centrally low VMT area shown on a VMT map, as I showed earlier, if the retail component was in either near transit or in a low VMT area, it would be presumed less than significant. Meanwhile, if the retail is locally serving rather than regionally serving, which is typical in these scale projects, that would be, under our guidance, recommended presumed less than significant. So that project would be presumed less than significant. And we anticipate that a lot of mixed-use development would end up presumed less than significant on the whole. For land use plans, for specific plans, we recommend using the same methodologies and significance thresholds as land use projects. For general plans, for whole jurisdiction plans, we recommend that consistency with the SCS aggregate across the jurisdiction it indicates less than significant impact. For regional transportation plans and sustainable community strategies, significant VMT reductions to achieve the ARB specified GHG targets, our recommendation is that achieves a less than significant VMT impact. So let's talk a little bit about transportation projects. I mentioned earlier that transit and active transportation projects we recommend presumed less than significant, and that hasn't changed. There was widespread agreement on that in comments, but we did get some comments on transportation on roadway project methodology. Two of the comments we heard frequently were that, first, the analysis might be burdensome for small transportation projects. So we recommended two methodologies in the previous draft. Each of those included operating a travel demand model and then including an estimate of land use effects. And that, for a small project, say a turn lane or a small addition of lane miles, that we heard comments on it was overkill, and that we agreed. Those methodologies can be applied to larger roadway expansions that include a number of lane miles, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And we got the comment that the project type, using just a project type, is problematic as a significance threshold. So in the previous draft, we recommended that addition of a general purpose lane without any management, such as designation as an HOV lane or tolling or other management, could be considered a significant impact. But there were concerns about using a project type as a significance threshold. So we've updated our recommendation in a number of ways for roadway projects. The first thing we did is provided a substantial list of projects which might and might not induce a measurable or substantial VMT. It's actually a relatively short list of those which might, and a long list of those that wouldn't. So you wouldn't be expected to do an induced travel analysis under our guidelines for a left turn pocket or for a short addition of lane miles, a merge lane, for example. But you would for a large addition of lane miles to a highway. Second, we shifted to a VMT threshold, a basic VMT threshold, rather than a project type threshold. So instead of general purpose lane miles perhaps triggering a significant impact, a certain number of vehicle miles traveled is now the threshold that we're recommending. And I'll talk in a little while about the about recommendations for what that threshold might be. We also recommend a fair, I'll talk right now about it. We suggest using a fair share threshold, considering the VMT that we can have in our state in the future and still achieve our greenhouse gas emissions goals. We focus on the 2030 greenhouse gas emissions reduction target in the governor's executive order. And then look at the number of transportation projects in the state and divvy that VMT fair share across those transportation projects to develop a threshold. I'll go through that with numbers in the case studies in several slides from now. We also make a we also include recommendation for a different methodology for calculating induced travel, one that's quite a bit simpler. Instead of requiring running of a travel demand model, this can be done in a spreadsheet in a matter of minutes, or at least an hour or so. And that simply relies on the elasticity factors found in the research. There's a substantial amount of research on induced travel that provides its magnitude, and that comes in the form of elasticities. In other words, the percent change in VMT resulting from a percent change in lane miles that the project adds. And those elasticities can be used with a little bit of simple algebra to provide a calculation of induced travel. A few other comments. First, we heard that rural is different. There are some cases in which rural can do quite a bit of VMT mitigation, and there are certainly cases where VMT mitigation is a challenge in rural areas. So we recommended that rural projects choose thresholds on a case-by-case basis, that they don't necessarily use the regional average, or the regional VMT per capita, rather, minus 15% that we've recommended that MPO areas use. Second comment we heard is that very small projects might trigger EIRs, might trigger significant impacts, and therefore EIRs, because of the use of an efficiency measure, VMT per capita. So we recommend a small project screening threshold of 100 vehicle trips per day. Below that, a presumption of less than significant. And we heard comments in comments we heard concerns about impacts to transit, and so we updated to clarify that addition of riders is not an impact per se, but blocking of stations or routes, transit stations or transit routes, may be an impact, may constitute a significant impact. We made substantial changes to our recommendations for addressing traffic safety. We heard quite a number of comments and quite deep concern about the recommendations that we had provided last time. So we went back to the drawing board and looked carefully at the research on traffic safety over the last decade or two, and brought recommendations from that. But first, a little background about what the statute says about safety. First, SB 743 specifies that existing traffic safety methodologies needn't be removed from CEQA, that our guidance is not, the role of our guidance is not to remove any existing safety methodologies from CEQA. 743 does not suggest any additional safety analysis, and we don't, in our technical advisory, we also do not recommend additional safety analysis necessarily, but we do provide broad recommendations regarding the approach to safety on any traffic safety analysis that might be undertaken. So a review of the recent literature, recent in the last decade or two, produced four, I would call them guiding principles for addressing traffic safety, and we share those in the technical advisory. The first of those is reducing motor vehicle speeds. The second is increasing driver attention. So those can go together. Reducing motor vehicle speeds reduces both the number of crashes and the severity of crashes, and thereby the safety of people, which we're trying to focus on in CEQA rather than the safety of vehicles per se. Increasing driver attention has been found in the recent research as a key factor in improving safety. And this is a reverse of maybe some of the older traditional approaches to safety, where wider lanes and larger clear areas around surface streets were assumed to improve safety by allowing drivers the opportunity to make errors and have the chance to compensate before running into an object. But it's been found through research that actually increasing driver attention by including narrower lanes in a project or vegetation alongside the road can actually lead to better safety, because drivers won't, for example, look down at a text message or use their phone otherwise, or adjust their radio if they perceive that it's not safe to do so. A third key factor in safety is protection of vulnerable road users. We've seen in years in our state, and this is great news, overall traffic fatality rates go down. That's improved. But rates for vulnerable road users, safety for vulnerable road users and fatalities there have gone up, and so it's important to protect them. It's also obvious that vulnerable road users don't have crumple zones. Fourth, reducing overall VMT and sprawl sorts of design can help improve safety substantially. And we provide some of the research. We provide research on each of these factors and share some of the numbers that have been found in that research in the technical advisory. We go further to urge caution on measures which address safety by increasing automobile throughput or speed, because those frequently create other safety issues, and to be mindful of trade-offs that compromise vulnerable road user safety. Okay, so I'll shift gears here a little bit and talk about data. As we have met with various groups and had various conversations and gone out and presented on 743, we've had questions about data availability, and we're very happy to report that in the past few months, the California statewide travel demand model has gotten up and running, and we have gotten data from it that can provide assistance with trip lengths for doing sketch model calculations. So we'll go through one of these in the case studies. It can be used for, it can provide assistance with setting thresholds. It can provide the background data needed to do that. And it can provide assistance generating VMT screening maps. The map on the right was produced by the CSTDM. The data from the CSTDM that we used is available. It's posted on the Caltrans website, and the URL is listed here. This is a good time to say that the slides from this presentation are available on our website in PDF form. So if you need to get back to this URL or anything else in our presentation, it's available on our website. Okay, let's move into case studies. We'll look at 3 case studies. These are the 3 case studies listed in the technical, along with the technical advisory in our materials. Again, those materials are on our website as well. The first is a residential retail mixed-use project, Stockton NT in Sacramento. The second, an office building in Mission Viejo. And a third is a roadway expansion, which is a hypothetical project that we cite in Kern County and use data from Kern County to calculate. So the residential retail mixed-use project first. This project consists of 214 multifamily dwelling units, 24 single-family dwelling units, and 6,000 square feet of locally serving retail. The project is located just over a quarter mile from a light rail station, and the surrounding residential, the residential right there in the neighborhood around it exhibits 12.1 VMT per capita compared to our recommended threshold for the Sacramento region when we use the CSTDM to crunch the numbers of 14.2 VMT per capita. So a side note here, that the project is just over a quarter mile from light rail station, in other words, within a half mile of a transit station. Following our guidance, we recommend that projects with that proximity to transit are presumed less than significant for the residential portion, at least. We also recommend that projects located in areas below the recommended where VMT exhibited by existing development is below the recommended threshold. In the green zone on the map we had earlier, that would be presumed less than significant. We also recommend that retail development that's locally serving, as in this project, presumed less than significant. So in this case, the analysis would not even need to be done, but we'll do it anyways just as an example here. And again, this analysis is shown in more detail in the latter pages of our materials posted on our website. So for this project, in order to calculate the residential threshold, we use data from the statewide model, the California Statewide Travel Demand Model, CSTDM. And then to analyze the project, we used the AHSC greenhouse gas quantification methodology, which is posted on the SGC website. That methodology uses CaliMod, and we made one variation to it, and that is to input trip lengths from the CSTDM. Now that's important because it's important that the data used for the threshold calculation and the data used for the project VMT calculation are from equivalent data sources. And again, both from the CSTDM in this case. We used home-based data because the mitigation calculation and the project VMT calculation required home-based VMT, so we couldn't use the household VMT or the tour-based VMT in this case. And then the project VMT mitigation, the project VMT mitigation is calculated within CaliMod and as a % reduction, so that's consistent as well. So we can check the boxes in that the project, the threshold, I've listed this incorrectly in the text on the slide, but the project, the threshold, and the mitigation are all in the same currency, VMT currency, all from the same, using the same modeling and the same type of modeling as well. Okay, let's look at an office project. So the Mission Viejo, it's a medical office, but for these purposes, it's a typical office. It's somewhere that people come to work in office space. It is 110,000 square feet of office space, again located in Mission Viejo. I pulled down this picture of it from the web, and I'm not sure whether I got it right. So if folks from this area see that I have the wrong picture, sorry, but this is the sort of project it is, at least. So how do we calculate the threshold? Again, using statewide travel demand model data. Also, to calculate the VMT from the project, we used CSTDM data. We looked at what the VMT was of office uses in that traffic analysis zone at TAS, and got the VMT data for the project from that. And then for mitigation, instead of using CaliMod, we went directly to CAPCOA's quantifying greenhouse gas mitigation measures, and pulled a number of mitigation measures from that document. Now, that CAPCOA document essentially catalogs the research on VMT reduction and provides guidance on what VMT reduction to expect given a certain mitigation measure. So we did that. It also provides guidance on how to combine those. So we followed that and came up with VMT mitigation of 17.2% in this case. So again, I'll note that we used home-based VMT data in this case, not tour-based data, but trip-based data. And we used the CSTDM for both project VMT calculation and threshold VMT calculation. And mitigation was calculated as a percent, so that's in the same currency as well. So again, check, we have all those three in apples to apples. Okay, a roadway expansion project. So calculating the threshold, we used results from Air Resources Board's vision model. They made an estimate a number of months ago of the VMT that we can have in the state and still meet our 2030 greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. So essentially that vision model looks at how much GHG reduction we'll get from improvement in vehicle efficiency. It looks at how much we'll get from improvement in from fuel decarbonization, and then looks at how much VMT we can get, or we will get, or will need. Bending of the curve on vehicle miles traveled. In other words, VMT growing less steeply than it has in the past. So that provided an answer, and we divvied that amount of VMT between the total number of transportation projects in the state. Now, in the guidance we have out now, the total number of transportation projects in the state is just an estimate, but we're working on getting a more accurate number and count. So in order to do the calculation, we simply use the academic literature on induced travel. As I mentioned before, there are about 20 papers that quantify the induced travel resulting from addition of lane miles, and use an elasticity to do so. We got the data needed to do so from its PEMS data. PEMS data we use for lane miles and vehicle miles traveled. So here's the math. The project the example project is a hypothetical highway expansion adding 2.2 lane miles to a highway, again, in Kern County. That's so we can pick the region, the Kern region, in which, Kern-Cog region, in which to draw the data from. So I described an elasticity earlier. Here it is on the screen. An elasticity is simply a percent change in vehicle miles traveled divided by a percent change in lane miles. And again, an elasticity is what the academic literature on induced travel supplies. So do a little bit of algebra on that, and the VMT impact equals the percent change in lane miles times the baseline VMT on those lane miles times the elasticity. It's that simple. It's a very quick and easy calculation. We plugged in the data. Again, it was PEMS data for Kern County. We plugged in the elasticity found in the most recent study. It's Duranton and Turner, 2011, the most recent major study on induced travel, to calculate the VMT impact. So percent change in lane miles of a 2.2 mile project is 0.328%. That's the percent change in lane miles. The existing vehicle miles traveled on those lane miles is 2 billion and change. The elasticity Duranton and Turner found was 1.03. We rounded to 1.0. Multiplying those together, the result was 7 million and change VMT per year. So again, a run through of how we calculated the threshold. This is the method we recommend in the technical advisory for calculating a threshold. First, California statewide VMT is 185 billion. That's the VMT on the state highway system. No, sorry, that's the overall VMT. And that exercise by the Air Resources Board using the vision model showed that the VMT could increase by 4% between now and 2030 and still allow us to hit our 2030 greenhouse gas emissions target. We then estimated the number of projects, transportation projects in the state, and again, this is an estimate, it's an extrapolation at this point, and that number that we came to is about 3,500 projects. And then we did the math on that and divvied that VMT over the number of projects, leading to a fair share VMT per transportation project of just a hair over 2 million VMT per year. So we then compared the project VMT to the threshold VMT, found that the project VMT is higher than the threshold VMT in this case, so the project would lead to a significant impact. Mitigation for the project might include tolling on new or existing lanes, management of new or existing lanes, providing travel demand management such as park and ride facilities, or a van pool program. Those are just some examples. So those were the case studies. Next steps. Our materials are currently out for public review, and that review ends February 29th. We then will finalize our proposal and send it to the Natural Resources Agency, incorporating those remaining comments. And it will there undergo the formal rulemaking process. We expect that that will be completed as well as the legal process that comes after it. It's a 60-day process. And SB 743, the guidelines pursuant to SB 743 will go effective in late 2016, the end of 2016, or early 2017. At that point, we have recommended a 2-year opt-in period. In other words, lead agencies have 2 years to work on their methodologies, to develop their significance thresholds, et cetera, before implementation is required, and that adds up to late end of 2018 or the beginning of 2019 to our best estimate. Okay, and I will talk about a couple of related initiatives before we open it up to general questions. First, I want to mention that Caltrans is undergoing some substantial updates in response to and to align with SB 743. And they're doing this through a process of developing transportation analysis guidelines and revising their transportation impact study guidelines. That comes to a mouthful of acronym, the TAG-TISG. So again, the TAG involves new methods for analyzing the effects of transportation projects, and the TISG will provide new approaches to characterize land use project impacts on the state highway system. That process is currently underway, and there are opportunities, and the project would benefit from broad stakeholder involvement. So we recommend taking a look at that project and getting involved in providing comments. Also, we're updating our general plan guidelines and have some recommendations around impact fees. So our first and primary recommendation in the negative is not to do the same thing in general planning as was done with LOS in CEQA. Do not use ad hoc LOS-triggered mitigation for all the same reasons that it was problematic to use in CEQA that we listed early on in this presentation. Using LOS, at least in the near term as other metrics are being developed to help plan roadway capacity, can be workable and helpful, but it's important to measure the project impact in a different manner and collectively. Ultimately, metrics of access to destinations or accessibility or connectivity, all of which mean the same thing, will, in coming years, be the best way to plan transportation networks. In each of these cases, we recommend that using VMT to estimate the project impacts is a better way than just using number of units or square footage, because just using number of units or square footage is not sensitive to when a project is located or provides well located or provides travel demand management, and therefore loads relatively little vehicle travel onto the network. If they do that, they should be credited, and if they are a project that does not do that and is located poorly and loads a lot of vehicle travel onto the roadway network, the impact, we recommend that estimates of project impact and impact fees would observe that and include that. On the whole, we recommend balancing automobility with other interests. For example, cost, neighborhood vibrancy, air quality, walkability, greenhouse gas emissions, human health. Those are all important factors to many people in cities and counties today, and we recommend that as LOS or as the planning of the transportation system rather moves into the planning process and out of CEQA, that it is a good place to consider all of those interests together. 743 does leave existing impact fee programs in place. However, as I just mentioned, we have some recommendations on how to methodologies for improving them or for adding new fee programs in place of the ad hoc LOS use in CEQA that has been done in many locations previously. Also, local governments can, I guess I said this already, the local governments can develop VMT-based impact fee programs. Those will ease the CEQA burden, align with the CEQA analysis, and broaden the types of improvements that can be funded. So with that, I will stop presenting and hear your questions. Chris Calfee and I will do our best to answer them. So Sahar Shirazi and Alec Kimmel of our office have been kind enough to assist us in pulling your questions and reading them for us.
Thanks. We got a few questions around the actual modeling of VMT, specifically wondering why we consider VMT easier to model, and then some questions about specific forms of VMT.
Great. I'll answer that question first. So in order to calculate LOS, and I'll go through it briefly because I went through it earlier in the webinar, you need to do a pretty sophisticated modeling. You run a travel demand model and see where the vehicle travel will go from the project. Or if you're not running a travel demand model, you need some other process, some level of sophistication to know where trips are likely to go. Again, that has a substantial amount of error associated with it, but it also requires a substantial amount of time and computing power. You need to know quite a lot about your network and about the array of destinations people might head for from your project or come to your project from. For a VMT analysis, it's much more aggregate. You just need to look. There are sketch models that help you just look at the characteristics of the project and refer to the research on how those characteristics affect VMT. Using the CSTDM data for trip length, you can use rather simple sketch models like CaliMod and that are downloadable and free. You know, once you're up and running, those analyses take a matter of hours. A large analysis maybe longer than that, days. But generally, again, what we've heard from folks who do both of these kinds of analysis, 10 or 20% the effort of an LOS analysis.
And a related question about how regional average and zone average VMTs are calculated and why they are more accurate.
Right. So a travel demand model can be used to calculate the overall VMT per capita in a region or in a city, and that's simply done by adding up all the VMT in the relevant traffic analysis zones and adding up all the population, and that gives you the VMT per capita. So it's just about choosing the correct TASs. The data that's on Caltrans's website, we have developed, OPR helped Caltrans develop a TAS map, so you can look on it and see which TASs are in your region or your city, or where your project, which TAS your project is located in, and then those TASs are referenced in the spreadsheet data that Caltrans has provided. Again, that's quite a bit easier than an LOS calculation because it doesn't require loading traffic onto the network in a travel demand model. There are other ways to get that data. Well, I would point to, first, regional travel demand models, which are likely to be, I think, in virtually every case, if not every, are likely to have more perfect, more accurate VMT data. We think the CSTDM data is sufficiently accurate. But if you have regional travel demand model data, we'd recommend using that so long as the project is not, the use of those models doesn't truncate the VMT analysis. That is, you don't lose a good amount of the VMT off the edge of the model. It's also possible to use travel survey data for developing both the thresholds and the threshold and the project estimate trip lengths. Yeah.
Great. Next question is about high quality transit. Excuse me. Does the agency have discretion in defining high quality transit? And they cited an example where they have high frequency transit service but with low ridership. So they may not consider that high quality transit.
I'll say ultimately the lead agency is making a determination, and we are providing technical advice in our tech advisory. We recommend high frequency, focusing on the frequency. So really the important factor for VMT from a project is how available the transit is. If there are a few people who happen to be on it, that isn't necessarily an indication of availability there, although it can be. But again, if there is a transit available at every 15 minutes, and that's 15 minutes or less, and that's what the research on which the reduction in VMT is based.
In the presumption that development near transit has no impact, is there a consideration of the jobs housing balance? So an example being jobs creating commercial development in housing poor areas could result in longer trips on average regardless of proximity to transit.
Right. So I would answer this by saying that the presumption of less than significant impact around transit is that it's a presumption. It's not an exemption for those areas. And if there is substantial evidence to be brought to bear showing that actually VMT would be above threshold, that evidence could trump the presumption.
We have a question here on vehicle technology, hybrid vehicles, recently electric vehicles, and how VMT reduction will be affected by the decoupling of this technology with our traditional technology.
Okay, how hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles, alternative fuel vehicles, I'll lump them in, might affect VMT? Am I getting at the question right? Just want to make sure that I heard it correctly. If you
Right.
need to read, okay, great.
Right.
There is some evidence currently that electric vehicles, which have tend to have shorter ranges, do affect travel patterns and can reduce VMT. That may or may not persist in the long run as technology improves and electric vehicle range improves. But generally speaking, vehicle travel, use of electric vehicles and hybrids and alternative fuel vehicles will benefit generally greenhouse gas, in our state, will benefit greenhouse gas emissions, will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and typically benefit air quality exposure. There are also the array of other impacts associated with vehicle miles traveled that I listed on a slide near the beginning, including an array of environmental impacts on the environment, such as farmland and sensitive habitat consumption, an array of impacts around health, including cardiovascular and other health factors associated with active transportation, and even in some cases stress, and those are connected to VMT aside from vehicle technology.
There were a couple questions on more stringent standards that lead agencies can invoke. Perhaps a few more examples of that.
Of more stringent standards lead agencies could invoke. There's a lot of flexibility there. If I would just answer it simply that that if lead agencies want to apply more stringent thresholds, that they can at their option. CEQA allows lead agencies that discretion broadly, and that includes with the VMT metric.
All right. Next question. Why not apply the same residential threshold to unincorporated areas of counties? That is, given that the switch to the VMT analysis will not eliminate counties' share of the RENA or their obligation to plan for their share of the housing, shouldn't they also be encouraged to direct residential growth to the most transportation efficient portions of their jurisdictions?
Yeah, great question. And the answer is that if I understand the question right, that I think we actually do recommend that, and I didn't talk about it in these slides. It's a detail that I didn't get to. In county areas, unincorporated county areas, we recommend using a threshold of either the regional overall VMT per capita minus 15%, the same threshold as in cities, or the aggregate of all the incorporated city VMT, so taking the average across incorporated areas. So that essentially means that the thresholds for county area, for outlying, or not outlying, but unincorporated county areas are the same as for incorporated city areas.
There's a couple questions regarding the connection between VMT reductions and meeting GHG targets. And how one could substantiate the other.
Right, great questions also. So one of the central impacts of vehicle travel is greenhouse gas emissions. And in California, we have a very strong focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have targets for future years enshrined in law and executive order, and we have various mechanisms, policy mechanisms for reducing GHGs. So it's possible, I illustrated this earlier, to look at how much will be needed from the from how much reduction in travel will be needed by vehicles given the other improvements that we'll have, for example, in vehicle efficiency and in fuels. And we have pivoted from those for some of our recommendations for thresholds. And I would again say this is a good example of somewhere where, or a good example of something in a lead agency might choose a more stringent threshold, but the threshold that we've recommended we see as kind of a backstop in what is aligned with state policy as a whole.
All right, next question. Regional average VMT and city or county average VMT over time is not static. Based on analyses conducted by traffic engineers for general plan projects we have worked on, the regional socioeconomic travel demand models show changes in VMT per capita and VMT per service population between existing conditions in the plan horizon year. For CEQA projects, should the regional average VMT or city-county average VMT be interpolated based on the project build-out year, that is, interpolate between the existing 2015 VMT per capita and the 2040 RTP horizon?
So, let me take the first part of that question, and then I might need Chris Calfee's help for the second part of it. True, the average VMT, or the overall per capita VMT in a city or region varies over time. It varies as the jurisdiction develops. It varies as the economy changes. And what would be important is to, well, first, CEQA doesn't require perfection. You don't need to look at the overall VMT per capita from yesterday or this morning. You know, a few years old estimate is likely to be sufficient. So that means that calculation can be done periodically. It doesn't have to be done for each project. So hopefully that is helpful. Did you want to add anything to that?
You know, in part, that is a legal question. The general CEQA rule is that you evaluate project impacts against existing conditions as they exist at the time of your project application. The California Supreme Court has recognized there may be circumstances when it's appropriate to look further out, particularly if your project won't go into effect for many years out into the future. So it really depends on the type of project that is under consideration.
Next question. It is recognized that a goal of the Caltrans strategic plan, oh, sorry, we answered that one already. That was a question regarding the 15% reduction. Okay. Please refer to CAPCOA on that.
Oh, is it the ability to reduce by 15%?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Here we go. The fair share threshold appears to treat all projects equally. Would it make more sense to use a common denominator, such as planned lane miles added, to identify a fair share per mile rather than a fair share per project? There are actually a couple questions related to fair share.
Gotcha. So, you know, we did a good amount of thinking and a good amount of discussion had a good amount of discussion with various stakeholders, and we settled on that it made the most sense to have for transportation projects an absolute threshold. One of the reasons was using an efficiency threshold means that small projects could be ensnared. And one of the comments that we heard a lot was that small projects, the concerns about small projects being ensnared, and absolute VMT threshold solves that problem. The fair share is an established methodology. So we, in an effort to provide safe ground, something that could be legally defensible, we used that for transportation projects.
Okay, a follow-up on questions about regional average VMT. If a freeway capacity from greenfield is increased, VMT averages for city center will go up without any development being proposed. How do we account for this?
Oh, great question. So the question here is connected to a CEQA project. So the question is, what is the CEQA project? Is it if we're talking about a roadway expansion that's going to increase VMT, or a project, a land use project development that's going to increase VMT? That's a first issue, but I think maybe getting more directly at the question, once you are looking at a certain project or a plan or program in CEQA under 743, it's important to look at the full area over which travel patterns are affected. In other words, it's important not to truncate the VMT analysis. If travel patterns are affected beyond the jurisdiction boundary, beyond the boundary of a city, for example, it's important to follow those impacts to reasonably. It's a good application of the CEQA rule of reason.
All right. Could you discuss a little bit, there's a few questions regarding CEQA exemptions, and we thought we might want to have a follow-up discussion on that.
Sorry, the question is?
Just to address CEQA exemption as part of SB 743, have we gone over that already?
We haven't gone over, actually this presentation is focused on the materials that we put out recently, which is the change in the guidelines. There is 743 does. I didn't discuss this when I was talking about the full all the components of the law, but that is a different component of the law that is already in effect and is not addressed. Chris Calpe, correct me if I'm wrong, in the guidance that we just released in our and is out for comment.
Correct. Not in that. Not in the one we just released. However, when OPR released a draft of the comprehensive update, we did include a change addressing that exemption in 743. And just in brief, it is an exemption that applies to residential, commercial, and mixed-use projects that are consistent with a specific plan, that are within a half-mile of transit and are consistent with the sustainable community strategy. There is additional information on OPR's website.
So for folks out there on the webinar, we, due to scheduling constraints, are down to one questioner, and so he's having to do a good amount of sorting of your questions, of which there are many. We appreciate them, but it may take us a little bit of time to get them up and prompted. When you're ready, short.
I'm trying to determine whether we've addressed statewide VMT or project metric has no relation to the size, efficiency, or benefit of the project. It seems inherently biased against large projects. why should small transportation projects be allocated the same amount of statewide VMT as a large project?
That's a great question. The simple answer is that large transportation projects have a greater environmental impact. I think I'll just leave that at that. It's a direct measure of the impact of the project.
All right. Would a reduction in GHG emissions by a project be directly proportional to a reduction in VMT, or would additional calculations need to be performed to determine GHG emission reduction?
This would depend on the project, I think. VMT and GHGs are generally pretty highly correlated, especially the more aggregate you're talking about. In other words, there can be differences in vehicle efficiency and that sort of thing, but for a general project, and there can also be differences in vehicle operations. But generally, they'll be pretty well correlated. Within CEQA, depending on the project, it will often be worth, though, doing a greenhouse gas calculation. For a larger project that currently uses MFAC and vehicle VMT speed bins, we would recommend continuing to use those methods for calculating greenhouse gases.
All right. A question on mitigation. Could you speak to the cost to fully mitigate your transportation case study? I believe this is referring to the current example, to a level of less than significant.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that that we think is positive about VMT mitigation is it's often it's sometimes positive cost, but it can also sometimes be negative cost. One VMT mitigation measure type that has is quickly gathering evidence and quantification methodologies is the amount of parking supplied, and parking is pretty expensive for a lot of projects, and so that mitigation of by reducing the amount of parking can actually save a project a good amount. I don't have on hand cost estimates for projects for VMT mitigation, but there are some that increase costs and some that decrease costs.
Regarding the case study in Mission Viejo, the questioner appears to have left, but we can still ask the question.
Please.
It seems one would not be able to afford living in Mission Viejo nor in the surrounding cities. So one would be traveling from elsewhere, and then if the employee were to pay, say, $6 per day with poor transit service, this would effectively punish the worker for working in Mission Viejo. Are there other viable mitigation measures?
Yeah, I would look for other viable mitigation measures. I would look at the CAPCOA guidance. Now, as far as housing affordability and the effect that that has on office project VMT, that will already tend to be captured in the CSTDM data on existing office development. In other words, if office development in a location requires importing workers a long distance, existing offices will tend to show that. So that will tend to show up in trip length and VMT data, so that will be reflected. So, there are a large array of the ways that costs are allocated and the way travel is subsidized. It is true that in our state and the vast majority of our workers enjoy subsidized free parking and a parking charge at the cost of parking may not be something they're familiar with paying today. Were that to be paid, it might change development and travel patterns, but that's again a whole other webinar. There is, I believe, a body of research on that topic, though.
As a matter of fact, there's a follow-up question regarding the effect that infill will have if housing is not made affordable. But you can feel free to speak more to that.
Yeah, briefly, again, VMT mitigation for infill development can actually lead to cost reduction, and sometimes that's cost reduction, as I was mentioning with parking, and as an example of the unit itself. If to build less parking, that doesn't get incorporated into the rent or purchase price of the development. But also affordability is frequently now being thought of as not just the cost of housing itself, but the cost of housing plus transportation. Those turn out to be our two, for the typical Californian, those are the two greatest costs in your budget. So infill development, because it's generally close to things, can save a lot of money on transportation and be inherently more affordable.
Back to the Kern case study, was the VMT per year estimate in that project based on, I believe that's all of the data from Kern County?
It was based on data from, yes, I would say data from all of Kern County. So we used regional data to come to that, both lane mile data and VMT data from Kern County, taken from Caltrans PEMS data, and then of course we applied elasticity from the academic literature.
Can you speak to how in the case studies the reduction calculations for VMT compare to level of service reduction calculations?
Right. So I would say actually a quick addition on the this is a detail on the Kern County data, that the data we focused on and our methodology recommends using highway and expressway, looking at VMT and lane miles on highways and expressways only. So does the data look across all of the local roads and the VMT on those local roads? No. But it does look across the full geography of the county on those roadway types I just specified. And sorry, could you ask that question again?
The actual question reads, how do the example VMT reduction calculations compare to LOS reduction calculations?
Right. I think I've addressed this previously, but essentially the LOS LOS calculations require quite a bit, require the running of a travel demand model. In some cases, well, LOS calculations require the running of a travel demand model and then micro simulation after that. So there's quite a bit of calculation to be done. For VMT, only in some cases will a travel demand model need to be run. For example, our regionally serving, our methodology and recommendations for calculating VMT from regionally serving retail would generally use a travel demand model run, but then you can just stop with that run. You don't need to do the additional micro simulation intersection by intersection. So still quite a bit less calculation to be done for a VMT estimate than for an LOS estimate. And that would be similar. I think the question might have been about mitigation. Similarly, for mitigation, same sort of calculation.
The web link to the California Statewide Travel Demand Model website identifies a spreadsheet that shows VMT per person per each TAZ.
Yes.
What is the regional boundary one would use under SB 743 if we compiled the data from this application? For example, in the SCAG region, is the regional average the county, the Council of Governments, or the SCAG region as a whole? I believe we may have addressed that already.
Actually, no, this is a new question. So the region, we generally recommend a focus on the region, and we did provide a suggestion for an exception, and it was sort of focused on SCAG. For many regions, the region is a reasonable geographic representation of the travel shed, the area in which travelers would go, most travelers would go in their daily travel. For SCAG, SCAG is big, and there's an argument that it's more than a travel shed. It's more than one overlapping travel shed. So this is gonna. I'm hoping I'm recalling the details that we have provided in our guidance correctly. But essentially, where the region is bigger than a travel shed, we suggest that using, I believe, a county level or a travel shed level might be appropriate.
Yeah. This is actually a two-parter. The second part is, does the data in the statewide travel demand model, does that data model population? And does the data in the California statewide travel demand model population and VMT, so those are two different data fields, population and VMT, differ from that being incorporated into the RTP? That is, does the model use the SCAG, TAV level population, and VMT data?
I'll answer that question in two ways because I'm not sure what the questioner is getting at. Hopefully it's one of these two things. So the CSTDM is a separate model from the SCAG's regional travel demand model. Generally speaking, where SCAG's regional travel demand model data is available, I would recommend using that regional travel demand model. It's going to be finer grain data. I'm not sure if I'm remembering the other part of the question. To get an estimate of one of the region, VMT from one of the region, simply use the map to ascertain which TASs are within that region and then find that range of TASs in the Excel file data. Hopefully that answered that question.
GHG is also caused by sitting in congested traffic, regardless of miles traveled. How does VMT address this issue?
VMT doesn't address that issue, but GHGs are required to be analyzed as well within CEQA. Now, generally speaking, the two will be highly correlated, but the person asking the question points out that in some cases, in heavy congestion, for example, there may be some discrepancy. Again, you'll be doing CEQA will include both of those analyses. GHG analysis is already being done.
Regarding the 2-year opt-in period, can a lead agency apply the new metrics for the first 2 years and then subsequently implement metrics for the remaining jurisdiction?
So can the lead agency implement across part of their jurisdiction and then the rest later?
I believe that's the
Chris,
question.
do you have any thoughts on this one? Hadn't thought through that before. First time we've heard.
That's correct. That's the first I've heard of this. My initial assumption would be, since it is an opt-in period, if the agency saw a benefit to only implementing immediately within a particular area, that it could do so.
Yeah, some complications may develop, but that might be worth thinking through.
A question regarding becoming involved in the development of Caltrans guidance. I believe they're referring to the TAG TSG.
Yeah. What's that? Sorry, the question?
The question is, how does one get involved in that process?
Good question. I should have the URL here, and I don't. Let me think about that and come back to it. I'll see if I can pull something up before the end of this webinar. Sorry, I don't have that information right on hand.
There are certain freight corridors for which mobility is important to productivity and the economy. How will those be distinguished from corridors that are more commuter-oriented?
That's a great question to kind of answer by pulling back and looking at the role of CEQA. So we've talked about significance thresholds, thresholds of environmental significance for vehicle miles traveled. Whether a project exceeds a significance threshold or the amount of VMT is not by itself reason to build or not build the project. So CEQA just looks at environmental impact, which is just one factor in the decision of whether to build a project and how to build a project and how, for example, in this example, to supply access to destinations for freight. I think the short answer is that VMT doesn't address that. Transportation planning addresses that, and that transportation planning will be done outside of CEQA to a greater degree than it was under LOS. Those two got kind of conflated with LOS and CEQA, and we see that as one of the substantial benefits that 743 will lead to.
Are there changes in recommended travel lane widths?
We, in our guidance on traffic safety, provide some evidence from the academic literature showing that narrower lanes on surface streets, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there you can find them in our technical advisory, are safer than wider lanes, and that's to the best of the reason for that is assumed to be because it improves driver attention and reduces can reduce speeds. But there is now a pretty good amount of academic literature showing that narrower travel lanes, narrower than we've traditionally built them on surface streets, are safer. There's references in our materials if you wanted to follow up on that and look in more detail.
How should BMT and other mitigations be monitored under Public Resources Code 21081.6?
So the same rules that apply to other types of mitigation measures under CEQA would apply to mitigation measures under BMT. The obligation on the lead agency is to, if there is a significant impact, to adopt changes to the project that would reduce that impact if feasible. So whatever those measures are that are adopted would be included in the mitigation monitoring and reporting program that are adopted along with the project. And the individual MMRP would specify exactly how monitoring is to take place over the implementation of the project.
There's a question about the timeline for the general plan guidelines update.
I'm sorry, we don't have that information handy right now.
We're currently reviewing the comments that came in on the draft, and we'll have to evaluate what changes, if any, are appropriate. So do stay tuned on our website.
Regarding a gap closure transportation project where a segment of a roadway is widened to match others that are wider with more travel lanes, would this qualify as one of the exempt types of projects?
Good question. So a gap closure essentially might induce a normal amount of VMT. It might induce a larger amount of VMT depending on the characteristics. If it were expected that it would be a normal amount, that it was a typical roadway expansion project and would have typical effects, we'd recommend using the methodology that I outlined in the case study and discussed in earlier slides as well. If it were expected that it would generate an unusual amount of VMT that per lane mile added, then modeling might be a better approach, and we have those methods are also provided. The terminology gap closure does not change the physical provision of additional lane miles, however. So the question is, sorry, just because something is a roadway expansion project is labeled a gap closure, doesn't change the amount of VMT per se that it induces.
There's a question regarding tourism. Uses or projects that may attract people from around the state or even internationally, and how will VMT measure these?
It's a good question. In some cases where tourism is not a significant percentage of overall VMT, it might be able to be ignored as not enough to matter. For some tourist destinations, that may not be the case, and in that case, really on a case-by-case basis, models and tools and research would need to be applied.
A question on the screening threshold, whether the 100 trips are daily trips or peak hour trips.
Those are daily trips in our recommendation. And I will answer the earlier question at this point of how to get involved in Caltrans's Transportation Analysis Guidelines, Transportation Impact Study Guidelines. The contact on that is Neil Peacock, and I'll give you an email address. Apologies, I'm going to be reading it to you, so get out a pen and paper or get your keyboard in position. Here we go. I'll give it twice. neil.peacock@dot.ca.gov. That's Neil Peacock at dot.ca.gov. I'll spell it out one more time to make sure everyone can get it. neil.peacock@dot.ca.gov. And that is, again, your contact person for getting involved in the TAG TISG effort. Great question, yeah.
Without using level of service, how will cities know which intersections need capacity improvements and how those improvements are funded?
Yeah, so again, 743 governs the use of LOS in CEQA, in the CEQA context. It preserves the police power of cities to use processes as they will to make transportation infrastructure decisions. So LOS is one way to determine, making projections of future LOS, for example, is one way of planning your transportation infrastructure. Now, that the decision on what infrastructure to provide, we would point to several factors that we would suggest be part of that decision. Again, mobility or access to destinations, even better, a full metric of access to destinations, so how long it takes people to get places. But if those metrics aren't developed in your area at this point, then using mobility metrics might be a next best option. LOS is an example of those mobility metrics, but again, with the caution of balancing automobility with the array of other interests that your local jurisdiction may have. We don't recommend looking at LOS in a vacuum.
Apologies. The earlier question that was asked on hybrid vehicles was actually not asked correctly. The question was actually with regard to whether VMT reduction will equate to GHG reduction through the introduction of hybrid vehicles. Specifically, it reads, where hybrid vehicles and increasingly electric vehicles are used, VMT reduction will not always equate to GHG reduction. How will this decoupling affect the new metric?
The short answer is that it won't affect the new metric, that a mile driven by an electric vehicle, hybrid vehicle, or alternative fuel vehicle is a mile driven, and it has an array of impacts, even if it didn't have any GHG impacts, and that wouldn't be the case for the foreseeable future for those vehicles. So they would have some GHG impacts, although, as the questioner suggests, it would be at least partially decoupled from GHGs. The GHGs would be less per mile traveled, but still all an array of the other impacts would exist. And I would refer you back to the slide that has the array of environment, health, and health impacts, and also, as an aside, the cost impacts, which are not part of CEQA, but are important for local decision making. So a mile traveled by any kind of vehicle is a mile traveled under a VMT metric. Let's take one more. I can see we've hit 5 o'clock, but we started 3 minutes late. So let's take one more question.
All right, final question. VMT is a harder concept to explain for the general public. How would you explain it in simple language?
I would explain it as the miles of vehicle travel loaded onto the roadway network. I actually think that that is a simpler concept than automobile level of service, although you can express LOS in 8F if you get into what that actually means in terms of delay moving through an intersection or density of traffic on a highway. That's actually a more complex concept, and I know for a lot of us who work in transportation, we're more familiar with LOS. But for the general public, VMT, I believe, is actually a simpler concept. Just, again, the amount of vehicle travel, the miles of vehicle travel that are loaded onto the roadway network. So with that, we appreciate your participation. We appreciate all of your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to some of them. There were actually a large number of people registered for this webinar. It looked like over 400, and a lot of you, a high percentage of you actually attended. We would appreciate your further comments and thoughts as part of the comment period on our materials, and if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to us directly here at the Office of Planning and Research. And with that, we'll sign off. Thanks one more time for joining us.